The morning Corporal Siobhan Delacroix walked into CFB Suffield's long-range qualification range. Nobody looked up. That was the first thing. Not the hostility, not the skepticism, just the indifference. 14 men seated along the prep bench, cleaning rods moving in steady rhythms, and not one of them registered her arrival as anything worth interrupting. She was 27 years old, 5'4" in her issued boots, and she had driven 11 hours from Petawawa through a February that had no intention of ending. She set her case on the far end of the bench and began to unpack in the same silence she'd entered. The range at Suffield sits at the edge of the Alberta shortgrass prairie, where the horizon is so flat and so far that the eye keeps searching for something to stop on and never finds it. Wind comes off that plain with a kind of honesty that mountain ranges never permit. No deflection, no apology, just a consistent lateral push that varies only in degree, not direction. The serious shooters knew this. The ones who'd been posted here long enough understood that Suffield didn't test equipment so much as it tested the relationship between a person's brain and the physics of moving air. That relationship either existed or it didn't. Sergeant Dominic Faucher didn't think it existed in Delacroix. He hadn't met her yet. He would form this opinion sometime around 11 o'clock that morning, based purely on what he could observe through a spotting scope. Her group placement at 300 meters, which was acceptable but not exceptional, and the way she adjusted between shots, which he interpreted as uncertainty. He was, in this interpretation, wrong. What he observed as hesitation was calculation. Siobhan Delacroix had been doing trigonometric wind corrections in her head since she was 17 years old, working trap lines with her father north of Flin Flon in conditions that a prairie range couldn't approximate. The pause before each shot was not doubt. It was arithmetic. But Faucher didn't know that. And so at 1100 hours, when he walked the length of the bench collecting preliminary score sheets, he stopped at her position and said, without particular unkindness, "You're grouping high left at distance. Might want to reconsider the load." She looked at him. "It's not the load. The wind's been consistent all morning." "The wind shifted 4 minutes ago," she said. 11 degrees. "I'm accounting for it." He looked at his own notes. He looked at the flag at the 200-meter marker, which was doing roughly what it had been doing all morning. He looked back at her. "The flag says us otherwise." "The flag is at 200, she said. "The target is at 800. "The wind at 800 is not the same wind at 200. She paused. "Sir." That pause before the honorific was the most expensive thing she said all week. Suffield's advanced marksmanship program had been running in its current form since 2009. Its formal purpose was to qualify candidates for sniper employment with conventional and special operations units, but its informal purpose, the one understood by everyone who ran it and everyone who went through it, was to find the people whose relationship with long-range shooting went beyond training, the ones for whom the physics had become instinct. These people existed in every generation, in every military, in proportions that no training pipeline could reliably produce. You could not manufacture them. You could only create conditions that revealed them. Delacroix had been nominated for the program by her warrant officer at Petawawa, a man named Hargreaves, who had watched her shoot for 2 years and had written in his nomination that she possessed. And this was a direct quote from the formal document, "A quantitative intuition for environmental ballistics that this warrant officer has not previously observed in a candidate of any rank." The nomination had moved through the system slowly, had been queried once on the basis of a medical notation that turned out to be irrelevant, and had eventually arrived at Suffield approximately 8 months after Hargreaves submitted it. In those 8 months, the program's primary instructor had changed. The previous one, a chief warrant officer named Gallagher, who had known Hargreaves personally and had actually read the nomination carefully, had retired to Kelowna. His replacement was Faucher, who had received the nomination as part of a stack of administrative material on his first week and had processed it at the speed of paper. This is how institutional failure usually works. Not through malice, through the accumulation of small inattentions. The first week was grouping work and wind reads. Siobhan shot well enough to remain unremarkable. This was a choice. She had learned early, not at Suffield, but in a junior hockey dressing room in Thompson, Manitoba at age 14, the only girl on a boys' AAA team, that being remarkable too early created a specific kind of problem. The resistance it generated was disproportionate to the performance. It was better to establish a baseline, let people form their assessments, and then exceed those assessments at a moment of consequence. This was not strategy so much as it was pattern recognition. She had seen it work before. She applied it here. Faucher's assessment of her, formed on day one and never seriously revised, was that she was competent but misplaced. He said this to his assistant instructor, a master corporal named Théodore Villeneuve, on the second evening. "She'll qualify at standard," he said. "She's not a specialist candidate." Villeneuve, who had been watching her shoot all day, said nothing in response. He had a habit of silence that Faucher sometimes mistook for agreement. It was not agreement. Villeneuve had noticed something on day two that he couldn't immediately name. It had to do with the interval between her wind reads and her shots. Most candidates, when they'd done their doping and made their adjustments, showed a brief window of confirmation behavior. A last visual check, a micro-tension in the trigger hand, some small motor signal that the conscious brain was doing a final review before committing. Delacroix didn't have this window. The calculation completed and the shot followed with a continuity that suggested the two were not separate events. He had seen this once before, in a master corporal at the Canadian Army Sniper Competition in 2019 who had subsequently been recruited to a JTF-2 selection. He had seen it once in 11 years. He watched Siobhan Delacroix and he thought, twice now. He didn't say this to Faucher. He had learned which observations were worth sharing and which were better held in reserve. The qualifying standards for the advanced program required a final exercise at 800 meters, prone in field conditions, with a scoring threshold of 85% on a figure target. This was the bar. Above the bar, you continued to the specialist assessment phase. Below it, you received a standard qualification and returned to your unit. Siobhan had done the arithmetic on the bar a long time ago. It was not the thing she was focused on. What she was focused on was the additional assessment. Faucher had mentioned it on day 3, briefly and without elaboration, that there would be an optional component available to candidates who cleared the standard threshold, involving a suppressed platform at extended distance without optical magnification. Iron sights. He described it as developmental, not graded, which was the sort of qualifier that ensured most candidates didn't bother. It added a day. It required staying on at Suffield when most people wanted to go home. She had gone to find him after the day's shooting was done. "The iron sights component," she said. "What's the distance?" He was writing something. He didn't look up immediately. "Why? I'd like to understand what's being assessed before I decide whether to attempt it." He looked up then. There was something in his expression she couldn't entirely read. Not contempt, something less organized than that. "It's a developmental assessment," he said again. "Extended range. Iron sights only. It's not graded, and it's not on your record either way. What's the distance?" He paused. 1,100 meters. She said nothing. "Most candidates," he said, not unkindly. "Don't attempt it." "I'll attempt it," she said. He nodded, slowly, and wrote something down. What he wrote, she would find out later, was not her name. It was a note to himself about whether the ammunition allocation for that day would need to be adjusted. Her name, he added as an afterthought. There are things that people who have never shot at distance don't understand about what happens to a bullet between the muzzle and the target at 100 meters. The first is time. At standard velocities, a rifle bullet takes somewhere between 1.5 and 2 seconds to cover that distance. This sounds fast. In terms of physics, it is an eternity. Gravity is pulling the projectile downward the entire time. Air is decelerating it continuously. Any lateral wind is deflecting it along a curved path that depends not on average wind conditions, but on the integrated sum of wind conditions at every point along the trajectory. The bullet that exits the barrel is not the same physical object in terms of its relationship to its intended target that arrives at 1,100 meters. The shooter does not aim at the target. The shooter aims at a point in space that does not yet exist and will only exist for an interval of about 12 milliseconds. This is what the iron sight problem means at extended distance. Without magnification, the front post subtends so much of the target that precise reference points disappear. You are not pointing at a thing you can see clearly. You are directing a calculation you cannot verify. What makes this possible, when it is possible, is a kind of procedural faith. You trust the numbers. You trust the read. You accept that the confirmation you want, the visual confirmation that the aim is exactly right, is not available to you, and you release the shot anyway. Siobhan Delacroix had been doing this in one form or another since she was a teenager in northern Manitoba with a .308 and a father who taught her that the moment of doubt was the moment of miss. The day of the iron sights assessment was overcast. Good conditions, as it happened. Overcast sky provides better target contrast, and the wind off the prairie was reading steady at 14 kilometers per hour from the northwest, which was manageable. She had been up since 4:30 doing the math, not because she needed that long, but because repetition was how she stilled whatever part of her brain wanted to interfere. By the time she arrived at the firing point, she had run the trajectory calculation 47 times. She was not nervous. She was very quiet. There were 8 people at the range that morning. 2 candidates who had also opted into the assessment, and their result, 6 other staff and observers. Faucher was there. Villeneuve was there. One of the observers was a lieutenant colonel named Prentice, who ran the training branch that administered the program. He was there for administrative reasons that had nothing to do with Siobhan specifically, a routine observation visit, the kind that senior officers make when they need to have seen things for their own records. He had a coffee and a thermos, and he was not paying particularly close attention when the first candidate shot and achieved 3 hits out of 100 meters, which was respectable. The second candidate achieved 2. Both had used optical sights at this distance before. Neither had made it work without glass. Then it was her turn. She settled into the prone, adjusted her position by approximately 1.5 centimeters without being asked, ran her natural point of aim twice, and then went still. The kind of still that is not the absence of movement so much as the presence of something else. Attention, maybe, or a particular quality of readiness that looks from the outside like calm. Villeneuve recognized it. He had his own scope up. He didn't say anything to anyone. The first shot broke at 0922, 2 seconds of nothing. Then the target shook. She ran the bolt and went through the sequence again. Adjusted 2 clicks on the rear sight. The wind had moved, a minor variation she'd picked up from the grass at the 700-meter mark 3 minutes earlier. She waited until it settled back. Shot. Target. She did this 10 times. When it was over, Villeneuve called the result. 9 of 10, 90%. At 100 meters. Iron sights. Nobody spoke for a moment. Faucher was behind his spotting scope. He stayed behind it longer than necessary. Prentice had set down his coffee. What happened next is the part of the story that takes longer to tell, and is in some ways harder to explain because it involves the behavior of institutions. And institutions behave according to logics that individuals often can't fully articulate even when they're enacting them. Prentice was the first to say something. He walked down to the firing point, stood behind where she was still kneeling in the dirt, managing her brass, and said, "Corporal." She looked up. "That's the best I've seen on this range in 4 years, he said. "Who nominated you for the program?" "Warrant Officer Hargreaves, sir, Petawawa. And you're in the standard track?" There was a pause, not from her, from him, because he just understood something he should have understood earlier, which was that a candidate who shot 90% iron sights at 1,000 meters was not on a standard track because anyone had made an active decision. She was on a standard track because the administrative machinery had not been paying attention. "We're going to have a conversation," he said, "about what the rest of your program looks like." Faucher had walked up by then. He stood slightly behind Prentice. His expression was the expression of a person doing recalculation, not embarrassed, not quite, but revising. She had the specific experience of watching a man update an opinion of her in real time and found that it produced no particular satisfaction. What she felt was more like tiredness. The updating should have happened earlier. It had not. She was here anyway. The conversation Prentice referenced did occur, 2 days later, in a meeting room that smelled like stale coffee and dry erase marker, with Prentice, Faucher, her, and a representative from the Career Management Office named Major Deshane, who had driven up from Edmonton specifically for this. It lasted 2 hours. Deshane spent the first 20 minutes reviewing her record with a focus that was almost, she thought, an apology, as though the thoroughness of the review was meant to compensate for the 8 months the nomination had spent moving slowly through the system. The outcome of the meeting was a formal recommendation that she be considered for specialist employment, with a secondary recommendation that her file be forwarded to a joint capability assessment board that convened twice a year for exactly this purpose. This was not the outcome she had anticipated when she'd driven to Suffield. It was not something she had allowed herself to anticipate. Hope, in her experience, was something you kept in a separate account and didn't spend until you knew the balance was real. Fosher said almost nothing during the meeting. Before she left the room, he stopped her in the doorway. "Hargreaves wrote in his nomination," he said, "that you have a quantitative intuition for environmental ballistics. I didn't know what that meant when I read it." She waited. "I do now," he said. It was not an apology. It was also not nothing. She accepted it for what it was. The assessment board convened in Ottawa that September. It was a 2-day process involving written evaluation, a panel interview, and, because she had been specifically flagged by Prentice's recommendation, a live fire component at Connaught that was not standard procedure for the board. The Connaught Range is the oldest military range in Canada, built over a century ago in the Gatineau foothills, and there is something about shooting on old ground that is different from shooting on a built range. She couldn't explain this. She noticed it anyway. Her father had brought her to Connaught once, when she was 11. He had been in the reserves, a sergeant with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, and he had come to Ottawa for a training course and brought her along, because her mother had been ill that month and there was no one else at home to stay with her. She had sat in the observation area, watching men and women she didn't know shoot rifles at distances that seemed impossible, and had decided, with the clarity that children sometimes have about their futures, that this was something she would do. Her father had been dead for 3 years when she shot at Connaught for the assessment board. He'd had a stroke in the spring of her second year at Petawawa, quick and without warning, and was gone before she could get on a flight from Ontario to Manitoba. He never knew about the Suffield results. He never knew about the nomination, which had already been submitted by then, but not yet acted upon. He died knowing she was a corporal in the army, and that she shot well. He did not know how well. This was the thing she carried into Connaught that September morning. Not grief, exactly. Grief had done its work in those first months after the phone call, and she had put it somewhere that was contained but not sealed. What she carried was the particular weight of the witness who doesn't get to see the end of what they started. Her father had taught her the math. He had taught her the patience. He had stood behind her on a frozen lake north of Flin Flon at dawn, and told her that the wind was always telling you something, and your only job was to listen. He had made her what she was, and he was not here to see what that turned out to mean. She lay down on the cold ground at Connaught and listened to the wind. The board's recommendation came back 6 weeks later. The formal language was, as military formal language tends to be, dense and without drama. What it said, translated into plain terms, was that she was recommended for specialist marksmanship employment at the highest tier of the classification, that her technical assessment placed her in the top percentile of all candidates assessed by the board in the preceding 5 years, and that her file was being forwarded simultaneously to 2 units that the letter did not name by their operational designations. She was in the cookhouse at Petawawa when she read it. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original crease, put it in the breast pocket of her combats, and finished her coffee. The woman across the table from her, a fellow corporal named Anankov who had been watching, said, "Good news or bad?" "Good," said Siobhan. "How good?" She thought about her father, about a frozen lake and the thing the wind was telling her, and the patience it had taken to finally, after all this time, listen. "The kind that takes a while to become real," she said. Anankov nodded, as though this were a normal thing to say. Perhaps, in their world it was. There was one more piece, and it arrived not from the Army, but from the Department of National Defense's Recognition Office, which had been working a separate track that Siobhan knew nothing about until it was nearly complete. Warrant Officer Hargreaves had submitted the original nomination for the program. What she hadn't known, because he had done it quietly and without telling her, was that he had also submitted a separate document to the Honors and Recognition Board. A recommendation, supported by 14 pages of performance records and range results, that she be formally recognized for sustained exemplary performance in marksmanship. The honors and recognition process in the Canadian Forces takes time. It took, in this case, nearly 2 years from submission to conclusion, which meant it ran concurrently with the Suffield program, the assessment board, the unit posting that followed, and the first 18 months of whatever came after that, none of which is part of this particular story. The certificate came in the mail to her parents' old address in Flin Flon because that was still on file as her home address and she had never updated it. Her aunt, who was maintaining the property now, forwarded it to her current posting. The envelope had been opened and resealed with tape, and there was a handwritten note from her aunt that said simply, "Your dad would have known what this meant before he even opened it." She read the note. She read the certificate. She sat with both of them for a while. Then she got up and went back to work. The wind wasn't going to read itself.